Hey everybody, a few weeks ago we converted our very own Inquisitor Coteaz and his Psyber-Eagle using all sorts of bits and pieces to match the classic artwork and really bring forward that Inquisitorial style aesthetic. Very grimdark. If you've not checked out that video already, be sure to do so, but we asked you at the end of it, do you want to see us paint it? And the answer was resoundingly yes, so in this video that's exactly what we're going to do. So without any further ado, let's get started. No matter what miniature you're going to paint, it's usually a good idea to start out by putting on that main colour. That's the first thing you see when you look at the model. And in the case of Coteaz, it's definitely the gold armour, and that's also true of our conversion. So I'm going to be looking to start out with the gold. So for an undercoat colour, what you want is something that's going to allow it to take very well and very easily, whilst also not making it difficult for further colours down the road. So a grey is a great choice for this. So I've gone for standard grey from the Colour Forge. And what we're going to do is start out by applying that gold. I want a nice warm rich one to begin things with. So I've got some Dragon's Gold here. Now to apply it, I'm just going to use a rough base coating brush. So I have a medium base coat brush here from Citadel, and what I'm going to do is just thin the paint down with a touch of water on the palette. Don't have to overdo it here because you don't need it to be too runny, but it's just a matter of thinning it so it doesn't clog any detail basically when you apply the colour. So with that thinned and ready, it's now a matter of just painting it onto the gold details. And the armour is of course the main one here, so I'm just going to be looking for all the armour plating, blocking it in, not worrying about anything else at this stage. But I'm also going to keep an eye out for any decorations that need to be gold, such as the little skull we've got on his little rosette right here, and also some gold details we can put onto his demon hammer. Here we have all that gold blocked in. At this point, it's quite a lot of it, but we'll break it up with some other tones on there later on. But before we do so, what we can do now is base coat his skin, because both the skin and the gold are going to use the same wash for shading. So I can apply it all in one go, you see, save a bit of time. So for the skin, what I'm going to do is base coat it with some Dwarven Skin for the mid-tone. And to apply it, I'm using a size 1 brush from Artisopus, so a nice medium-sized brush here. Good size for the sort of thing that we're doing, and with this colour it's just a matter of blocking all this in. Now I am of course going to be careful of the gold around the collar as I do this, so especially around the chin, just need to take time around there, but everything else doesn't really matter at this stage because we'll clean up as we add further base coats onto the miniature. Now that's done, it's time to get the first wash onto the miniature, and in this case I'm looking for a reddish brown, a nice warm colour to really bring out some life in the skin and also on that gold. So flesh wash is ideal for this, and to apply it I'm going to go for a large brush now because I'm going to put on quite a lot of it. So here I have a medium shade brush from Citadel. With this, just going to load up a generous amount there on the brush, then start applying it onto the model, looking for the skin and also that gold armour. So just running it on and letting it settle in the recess detail. Now, if you're applying wash in this quantity on a miniature, you do need to keep an eye on how it's settling because it's very easy to overdo it. So you can see as I'm putting it on, in some areas it's pooling quite a lot, in particular around the collar just there. Now, if you spot something like this happening on any miniature painting, you must move away the excess with your brush, kind of using it like a sponge really, because if it dries like that in that quantity, it won't look very nice. So just keep pushing it around the miniature to about the sort of quantity we're getting just around here, and then give it about 45 minutes to dry. Here we have the model with that wash now dry, giving that definition, but it has dulled down things quite a bit. Now, I will address that later on with some layering, but before doing so, it's a good idea to try and get on as many base coats as possible. So I'm going to start some more now, which once again are going to share the same colour wash. The first colour for this is going to be some red. I'm going to use some Sanguine Scarlet here, and to apply this one, I'm going for a slightly smaller brush than I was using with some of the base coats earlier. This is a size 0 from Artisopus, so a little bit smaller, a little bit more focused, and that's because with this colour, there are a few trickier details to get to as I block it in. So paint thin and ready, going to start looking for these features, and the main ones of course are going to be things like the cloak, so I want to paint all of this. For the back of it I will switch to a larger brush, but having the smaller one here is very helpful as I get close to the back of his armour there. Also the inside of the loincloth on the original model was red as well, so I'm going to be doing that in this case as well, so around here. Also I'm going to be looking out for some smaller features that will look good in red, so for example the eye on his Inquisitorial rosette. I've now finished applying that red onto the model, and I'll be honest with you, painting the red on the underside of that cloak is quite a pain on this miniature. So I have got one or two little spots where I've caught the gold on the inside of the legs, but that's not a problem because we'll clean that up when we layer the miniature later on. But now what I'm going to do is get some more base coats on there, and we'll start out with the colour for the outside of the loincloth. Here in the original miniature it goes to a sort of ivory kind of colour, so I'm going to do that by starting out with the base coat of Griffon Claw. With that done, it'll then be time to base coat all the joints and any leather we might be able to find, and here I want an off black, so I'm going to use Death Reaper. But But we'll start out with that Griffon Claw, and to apply it I'm going to stick to the same brush, so this size 0 is ideal for this sort of thing once again, and all I'm going to do is get that thin down just like with the red and start base coating this area. And what we're looking at is the front of the loincloth just here, so it's a matter of just neatly applying it onto this area, just trying to keep it on the front, leaving the side of it still red, so you can just see a hint of that red showing through around the edge there. Here we have the loincloth base coated, and also I just want to point out, I forgot to mention, but the head of the hammer is going to be marble, so I also base coated that with Griffon Claw at this stage. But with that done, it's now time to move on to the black. And here I'm using some Death Reaper. This is first of all going to be for all the joints in the armor, but also keeping an eye out for any leather. I'm also going to base coat the frame of his hourglass with this color at this stage too. With that black done, we can now move on to 3 more base coats because I want to get these on before putting that next wash on the miniature. And the first of these needs to be a Burgundy, mainly for the haft of the Demon Hammer, but also Purity Seal Wax. Here I'm going for some Sword Hilt Burgundy. Now once that's done, we can then pick out the parchment with a darker bone colour. I'm going to use some Dragon Fang here. And then finally, what we need to do is make sure that all the fur over his shoulders are nice, even dark grey. So I'm going to use some Dungeonstone Grey for this. But first we'll need that Burgundy, so I'm using Sword Hilt Burgundy, still applied using the size 0 brush, and the main part of this is of course the haft of that Demon Hammer. So with the paint thinned and ready, we're looking at this textured part of the grip just along here. Just going to base coat the entire thing along here, but also keep an eye out for any Purity Seal Wax, and we've got some here on these scroll casings just around here. Just want to get these parts at this stage too. Now that's done, we can base coat the parchment on these scrolls here with a darker bone colour, so I'm using some Dragon Fang. Then finally I'm moving on to Dungeonstone Grey, and this is a nice dark grey to base coat all of the fur going over the shoulders. Now that we've got all those base coats applied to the miniature, it's time to put that second wash on, and in this case it's going to be a dark brown wash. So I'm going to be using some Battlemud Wash here, and because of the way that all these details are laid out in the miniature now, we'll have to change brushes a few times whilst doing this. But to start out with, I will use a small one. There's going to be my size 0 here, and this is going to be for the more intricate parts to begin with. So for example, we've got the Inquisitorial rosette on his chest, and it's going to be for areas like that. So we're looking to apply it over all the new colours we've added since the gold, such as this part. You can see how it just takes that careful application then just to make sure it's focused just on this area and keep it off the gold. Now I am going to be doing things like the loincloth, details on the hammer, all those parts that we've painted in, but I'm not too concerned about shading the back of the cloak, and that's because all of this later on I'm going to shade with a bit of wet blending. However, I do definitely want to make sure it's nice and dark around the back of him, so I am going to be poking some of this wash onto the underside just around here as it goes into shadow behind his armour. The brown wash is now dry too, so it's time to move on to adding the next colour, which is going to be the silver, and this again is going to use a different wash, this time a black wash for a nice clean finish to it. So I'm going to be using Surcoat Silver for the base coat, and for the wash I'm using Oblivion Black Wash. Now I'll start out with that Surcoat Silver, and to apply this I'm again going to use my size 0 brush, and this is mostly going to be details that appear on the Demon Hammer, but there are a few select bits on Coteaz's armour I want to get. I'm really looking at some of the equipment around his belt, so you can see he's got these keys just here. I think these need to be picked out with the silver, so I'm just going to neatly base coat these. Just being really careful of all that surrounding detail at this stage. But for the hammer, it's going to be all the mechanical parts. So for example, we've got these little details around here that look like energy generators and things. I'm also going to be base coating the face of each side of the hammer as well. With that silver base coated, it's now time to apply a black wash over the top. So here I'm using some Oblivion Black Wash, and just like with that brown wash earlier on, I need to keep it focused just on these parts, so just on the silver in this case. So for that reason, I'm sticking to my size 0 brush. And here we have the model with that black wash dry, and we can move on to the next step. Now there are some base coats yet to do later on, things such as the white details in the miniature, but I'm not concerned about those for the time being, because what I want to do is pick them out with more fine detail after we've done the main majority of the miniature. But what we can do now is a bit of dry brushing. It's quite a messy step. I am specifically doing this here on the fur at this stage because as I do this, it's inevitable I'm going to catch surrounding details. And if you're doing a model like this with lots of fur on the shoulders, it's always a good idea to put it in at this stage, basically before the layering and before we really go into detail painting the skin, because then you'll be able to clean up as you go around those parts, because you probably will catch them as you do this. I know I certainly will. Now what we're going to do is start out by going back to a grey, and I want a slightly lighter one than the original base coat here. I'm going to use Wizard Grey, and to apply it I've got a small dry brush from Citadel. So here we go, a relatively new one as well, where the bristles are holding together at a fairly close point, so sort of a chisel point really. You need to get a bit of this on the brush, then get some tissue and start working it into the paint bristles whilst removing the excess paint. So just work your way along, just twisting the brush around to make sure you get all the different angles, and once you're down to about this sort of point, you'll be ready to go when you're dry brushing fur. So what I'm going to do is just start looking to brushes across the texture to pick it out, so lightly brushing along like this, and you can see it's basically inevitable. I'm going to catch surrounding details, but it's okay because we'll clean those up as we come to them later on. With that done, we can now move a little bit lighter with the colour tones here, and at this sort of stage with fur like this, I like to go towards khaki tones because it tends to be a little bit more natural going this way. Sometimes sticking with just a grey can look a little bit cold and a bit artificial, so that's why I'm going the direction I'm going here. I'm going to start out with some sandstone, again dry brushed on, and then even lighter than that, I'm going to go for some temple stone. We'll start out with sandstone, and to apply it I'm sticking with the same brush, which I have made sure is clean and completely dry. So remember, when you're dry brushing, do make sure your brush is totally dry before you start, else the paint can go a little bit streaky. The setup's going to be much the same as we did before, by just working the paint into the bristles, but going a little bit further this time so that the application is going to be lighter. Really bringing it to about that sort of strength there in the paper, you see. So very light, and then it's a matter of applying it in the same way that we did in the previous steps, just brushing lightly back and forth just to bring out that texture. Next, it's time to move on to a lighter khaki colour. So here I've got some temple stone, and again I'm dry brushing it on, but this time I've just got a little bit further in removing the paint off on the tissue, and the application is just a bit more of a light flicking motion. And here we have that fur completed. Now if you look carefully, you can see I spent just a little bit longer dry brushing towards the top, and that way what we get is a nice highlight going across the top there. As it gradually gets darker, the further down the fur that we go. And with that done, we're now going to move on to the next phase of painting Coteaz, which is going to be to paint his skin. And when it comes to a model like this, I always like to complete the skin at this stage because it adds loads of personality and character to the model, which I find is really encouraging for really taking it through to completion. So I always like to stop here just to do that part. And so to do it, first of all, we just need to clean up the flesh. And so for this, what I'm going to do is go back to the original colour that I base coated with. So it's going to be Dwarven Skin in this case. Just layer it back on there just to get things all nice and tidy before we move into highlighting it. So to do this, I'm going to be using my size 0 brush, but you might want to have a smaller one on hand if you're doing this sort of thing for a bit more control. It really depends on the sort of face that you're doing and how much detail's on it really. But the idea now, just make sure the paint's nicely thin down the palette, a little bit translucent there, just adding that water until it's down to about this point. Then it's a matter of removing excess paint by just twisting the brush like this, bringing the bristles to a nice point, and this way we'll have lots of accuracy as we apply the colour, because this time we just need to be careful to avoid recessed detail. So if we start on his nose, for example, what I'm going to do is just very carefully follow the centre of it and go down the side there, so just there like that. And then you can see we've got a recess next to it as it drops down, but we want to skip past that and carry on again as we go on the cheeks. So just here, for example, just follow that round, around the eyes, round to the brow, all the while looking for recessed parts and just carefully avoiding them. With that done, you can see the skin is now looking much better, so we can move on to highlighting it. And in this case, what we now want to do is go for a lighter flesh tone, but then beyond that, if you want to take it further for a character like this, you can do so by putting in a pale bone colour. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to start out with some Elven Skin, and then for that bone colour, I'm going to be using some Vampire Fang. But we'll start out with Elven Skin, and to do this I recommend now that you switch to a small brush. So it's really important to make sure you have that accuracy in a small brush to help out with that. This one's a size 00 from Artsopus, but if you want to go for a Citadel one, a small layer will be absolutely fine. Basically one that holds a good point, because you just need to be a little bit more focused than you were in that previous stage. Just going a little bit further, twisting the bristles together so you have that fine point, and then when you're ready, it's time to start looking for features that stand out. So the obvious one to begin with is going to be the nose. I always like to start in the centre of the face like this, just for a nice grounding, just to get started. So just want that line down the very centre and just a little bit at the base there. Then we can go for the brow, where it's a matter of just painting a little bit going across there, a little dot around that furrow in the centre, and then on the other side too. We can then pick out the cheekbones just around here, and then when it comes to the forehead, it suits this character to put a few wrinkles on there for that furrowed brow. So that's what we're going to do here. It's going to angle the model like this, so I'm painting downwards and towards myself so I can see clearly what's going on here, and then it's just a matter of painting a few lines just going across this region just here. And then for the top of the scalp, just make sure you've got a small amount of this paint just thin down and just thinly glaze it onto the top by just doing a very thin coat along here. And then finally we can add a fine highlight using a pale bone colour. So here I'm using some Vampire Fang, and I have thinned this down a fair bit, and with that small brush, once again, what we're looking for are the parts that really stand out. So it's going to be just a little bit on the tip of the nose right there, a small amount on the brow, just following that ridge going along there, and then just a little bit on top of the cheekbone just down here. And with that, the skin's now fully highlighted, giving him that suitably stern expression there on the face. And so now I'm going to move on to painting the eyes. Now, always remember when it comes to painting eyes, it is entirely optional. You certainly don't have to do it, but for a character, it does really add a lot of life to them. So I'm definitely going to do it here. And to do it, a great way is to start out with a pitch black. I'm going to use some Doom Death Black here, and then we need a pure white. So here I'm going to use some White Star. We'll start out with that black. So Doom Death Black, and again, definitely go for your smallest brush. So again, I'm using my size 00. And what you should do for this is to thin the paint down so it's quite inky. So I added a fair bit of water there. You can see how runny it is. But then the key thing, remove excess paint there on some tissue, draw up some fresh, and this way you'll have the correct amount on your brush and a nice fine point there as well. Because now you can brace your hands to be as steady as possible and gently approach the eyes from this sort of angle and just paint that black line in the deepest recess. And now ready for the tricky bit, using a pure white. So here I'm using some White Star, again with a size 00 brush, and the idea is to paint a little dot of this colour on either side of that black line that we've just done. So just very carefully going and dotting that in there, and then on the other side, just in here. And here you can see the result of painting the eyes in on the face. Now it is tricky to do, but you can see the result is it really adds lots of character there. So with that done, it's now time to move on to the next phase of painting the miniature, which is going to be to layer the colours that we've got on so far. And we're really going to focus on the important ones here. And the most important out of all of those is going to be that gold. So for this, I'm returning to Dragon's Gold, and to apply it, I'm going to be using my size 1 brush to begin with, but it's a good idea for this sort of thing to have a smaller brush on hand for when you're going around more intricate details, because here we need to reapply it onto the areas we originally base coated with this colour, but it's a matter of avoiding recessed detail where more of your shading is. So for example, if we take a look at the body armour around here, it's a matter of just painting onto flat areas like the shoulder plates just here, just along areas like that, but as you get to recessed parts, such as this little gap we've got underneath here, you skip past the darker part and carry on again on the other side. So now it's just a matter of doing this across all of this gold armour. Here you can see the result of doing that layering there on the metallics. It really brings back that shine. And as I was doing it, I just decided these recessed Inquisition symbols, you can see on the thigh plates just there, and there's some on the front of the legs too. I thought it'd be cool to leave those textured parts with the wash still on top of them, so you can really see the contrast there. It adds a nice bit of decoration, I think, to the armour. But with that done, what we're now going to do is some more layering and some more colours. And the first of those I want to do is going to be the loincloth, and at the same time I can do the head of the demon hammer. In this case, I'm going to return to some Griffon Claw. Now with that done, then I'm going to do some layering on the small bits of parchment, and here go a little bit lighter than the original colour. So I'm going to use Skeleton Legion, then finally going to do a little bit on the red. And so here I'm going to return to Sanguine Scarlet. But first of all, it's time to apply some Griffon Claw, and to apply this one, I'm going for the size 0 brush again. And whilst it's still layering like we did on the metallic of the armour, when you're doing layering on fabric, it's a little bit different in that it's the creases that you're really looking for as opposed to any panel lines and things. So once the paint's ready, the sort of thing we're looking for is going to be fabric such as just here. And you can see the idea is just to line up so that you're painting following the direction of the creases and concentrate with the tip of the brush on the raised up areas. So that means smoothly applying it onto areas like this, not going quite to the deepest area, just skipping past and just carrying on again there on the other side. And see this way, you get some nice smooth layers. In addition, I'm going to do a little bit of layering on the head of the demon hammer just here, and this is going to be a bit more like the armour, where I'm just looking for recessed panel lines. I'm just going to be careful to avoid those parts. Next up, it's time for a little bit of layering on these scrolls just here, and in this case I'm using some Skeleton Legion, and it's similar process as before, looking for the flat parts and just being careful to avoid recesses. And then finally, I'm just going to do a little bit of layering with some Sanguine Scarlet. So this is mainly going to be the layering on the Inquisitorial rosette just here. Again, looking to avoid the recesses, which is around that skull just there. But also, it's a convenient opportunity just to clean up the red of the cloak as well. With the layering done, those colours are all nice and tidy, so we can take them on to highlight them. And for this, I'm going to start out with the gold, seeing it's the most prominent colour on the front of the miniature. And so here, we need a really pale gold. I'm going to use Glistening Gold for this. And to apply it, I'm going to use a small brush here, because basically I'm doing some edge highlighting, so a size 00 is perfect for it. This is going to be the same sort of technique on highlighting any sort of suit of power armour, really, any sort of space marine, anything like that. Basically, just looking to apply this colour on sharper edges of the detail of the armour. So to do that, the trick is to make sure the paint's thinned down correctly, and you're looking for it to be a little bit runny when you're doing this sort of thing. Not so running that it runs out of control off your brush, but thin enough that it flows easily. And you can always test it on your palette by having a go at painting a few lines. If those lines go on quite well, which they're doing just there, then you're at about the right sort of consistency. It takes a little bit of practice to find it because it is different with different paints, but once you've got the hang of it, it's quite easy to get hold of it. So with that prepared, what I'm going to do is just make sure the brush is ready by just removing excess paint so it stops the bristles flaying really, so we get that nice point on there. Just load up fresh, twisting the bristles as we do so, and then it's time to start looking for the edges. So where possible, I'm going to be using the side of the brush to pick out sharper edges, such as around the gorget just here. You kind of approach there with the side of the brush and just skim along the edge. Doing this sort of technique makes it nice and easy to get sharp edge highlights on those areas. But it's not going to be possible to always do that just because of the nature of how densely packed some of the detail is. So for example, on this stylized pectoral just here, in this case, I can use the tip of the brush and just make sure I angle the model so I'm painting this downward motion, just turning it as I need to make sure it's easy to follow that edge. The result of applying that highlight is that we've got that really nice shine to the armour now, suitable of an Inquisitor of Coteaz's stature. And you'll notice if you look closely, these designs on the knees just here, these skulls with the wreaths and also the Inquisition symbols on the belt and the skull just there, I've not highlighted those. And that's because on the original Coteaz, these details are picked out in white, like skulls and things like that in those locations. So I want to allude back to that later on, so I'm going to paint them white instead, so why not bother highlighting them. What we can do now is move on to highlighting another colour, which is going to be the silver. And here I've got some Mythril Blade, so nice bright shiny silver. I'm going to be applying this in just the same way as what I did with the gold, except on all the silver details. So, just like before, need to make sure that paint's nice and thin and nice and smooth. Just testing it on the palette to make sure it's flowing just right from the brush, so about that's good. And then, as ever, be careful not to overdo it. So it's now time to start looking for silver features, such as these little bits that we've got on the side of his head. And just like with the gold, I'm looking for those sharper edges and just going to very carefully follow along those lines to pick these details out. With that, the silver's been highlighted too, so it's time to move on to highlighting smaller details on here, and the first of them is going to be for some red. Now this is actually going to be quite a small detail. Really, it's just the Inquisitorial rosette, so I'm not going to do the cloak just yet. I'm going to go quite light on the highlight because I want the red tone to match what the cloak's going to have later on. So for that reason, I'm going to start out with some demon red, so nice bright red. Then I'm going to add a very small amount of a bright orange with some orange flare. I'll start out with Demon Red, and to apply it, I'm going to be sticking to that same brush, so the size 00 once again. And with this, it's going to be a little edge highlight, like with the armour really. I'm just looking for the edges of the symbol. I'm just going to carefully pick them out. So looking at this detail just around here. Next, I'm going to add a very fine highlight with a bright orange. So here I'm using some orange flare, and this is just going to be a very gentle highlight applied towards the corners of the eye, just along there and along here. With the red of that rosette now highlighted, it's time to move on to highlighting some smaller details that appear in the miniature, and we'll start out with the black features. Here I'm going to be using a dark grey, so I picked out some Dungeonstone Grey for this. With that done, it's then time to move on to highlighting the ivory parts and also the marble that's on the hammerhead. Here I'm going to be using some Ivory Tusk. Then we can move on to highlighting the grip of his demon hammer and also purity seal wax for the pink. I'm going to use some glistening gums for this. Finally, what we need to do is finish off highlighting the parchment, and here I'm going to use some Vampire Fang. But first of all, it's time to highlight the black details with a dark grey. So I'm using some Dungeonstone Grey here, applied again using that small size 00 brush. With this colour, I'm looking to pick out any texture of the black details that we've got. So, for example, there are the joints in the armour, which are a little bit tricky to get to, but you can see they've got that ridged texture to them. So to emphasise that, I'm just going to apply a few lines across these areas. So, for example, just along here. Now it's time to move on to highlighting the ivory coloured parts. So here I'm using some Ivory Tusk. So an off-white here, and first of all on the head of the hammer it's going to be a pure edge highlight, just like with the armour. So where possible I'm just skimming along with the side of the brush to get that sharp highlight along those edges, such as just there. Meanwhile on the loincloth I'm going to be looking for the peaks of the creases. So you see there's a few just around here. I'm just looking for that line where they really stand out. I'm just going to follow along those areas with the tip of the brush. Next up, we can highlight all the burgundy details. So here I've got some glistening gums, so a nice pink colour. And with this, first of all, we've got the wax, where we're just going to pick out the outer edge of these seals. And then it's time to do the grip of the hammer. In this case, you can see the texture is like this diamond cross section. So I'm looking for the top of each of these segments. I'm just going to run a line across each one. And then finally, we just need to highlight the parchment. So I'm going to be using some Vampire Fang here, and it's just a matter of looking for any edges that stand out, such as these corners we've got going down here, and then just add a few light lines just to give the impression of a few creases. And with that, all those colours are highlighted. So at this stage, we're just going to pause to add a bit of detail onto the head of the demon hammer, just to give the impression of it being made from marble. And to do this, just need to add in some veins on there with a darker khaki colour. I'm going to use some sandstone for this, and to apply it, I'm going to stick to the small brush. So using the size 00 again. Just going to make sure I thin this down so it's a little bit runny. So down to around about this consistency just here, perhaps just a bit thinner actually. And to about that point there is good. And then just make sure there's a small amount on your brush, almost like setting up for doing edge highlighting. But I'm just going to look for the flat areas like on top of the hammerhead just here and start to create the impression of veins on here. And to do that, all we've got to do is just start applying some slightly rough lines running across it just there like that. Now, because I thinned the paint down, the first pass is going to be quite thin there and not stand out too much, but that's good because once it's dry, just go in for a second run, and this way what you'll get is a bit more depth in the veins as you add that colour a little bit more towards the centre. So really it's just a matter of building it up like this. And with that, we've now got that effect of the veins on the marble. And so at this stage, all those colours we've been painting in are highlighted, except of course for the cloak, because now we're at the stage where we can do some blending on this. And we'll start out by shading it. In this case, I'm going to be leaning on the original colour that I painted it. So remember, it was a base coat of Sanguine Scarlet originally. But what I'm going to do is wet blend this with a darker red. So I've got some Berserker red for this. And this way we'll get nice gradients for the shading. So to do this, what you'll need to do is get both paints ready at the same time. And you might be under the impression that this technique's quite hard to do. It really isn't. And if you've never tried it before, I definitely encourage you to give it a go because it's actually quite fun. It just requires just a bit of confidence essentially just to go for it. Now, first thing to do is to set up both your colours, and to do so I'm using my size 1 brush. Just going to get some of the Berserker red thinned down and ready on the palette. Then do exactly the same thing with Sanguine Scarlet. So a little bit of water, thin that down, and there we go. And I'm going for the sort of consistency I'd aim for if I was doing a base coat on something. So with that prepared, what I'm going to do is start out by grabbing some of the Sanguine Scarlet, and I'm going to apply it close to an area where the blend's going to be. So if we take a look at this crease just here, the idea is to put the darker colour into that recess there, and then have it smoothly going to a lighter colour as it comes out of that recess. So I'm going to apply this red right next to where that shading is going to be, not going quite into the darkest area, just going close to it there like that. And then whilst that paint's still wet, I'm just going to grab some of the other colour without even washing my brush. So now it's Berserker red, apply this into that recess and go back and forward, just pulling it into that previously applied colour. And there you go, you get that nice gradient on there. Now when it dries, you might get a slightly scratchy appearance to it. And if you do, don't worry about it. Just let it dry completely and then do a second coat in the exact same way. And here you can see the result of doing that blending. We've got some nice smooth shading there on the red fabric of the cloak. And so now we can move on to highlighting it. And for this, we'll start out with blending again, this time going towards a lighter red. So I'm going to use Sanguine Scarlet once more, so our mid-tone, but this time I'm going to introduce some Demon Red to it. Now once that's done, we can then finish off the red fabric by going for that orangey highlight like we did on the rosette earlier on. So here I'm going to be using Orange Flare once more. But first of all, we need both Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red. And you can see I've got them ready. We've got Sanguine Scarlet from the previous stage, but Demon Red just needs to be thinned down just like we did with the colours earlier on. Now I've gone for a slightly smaller brush now, a size 0 for a little bit more control, but the process is largely going to be the same, where we're looking to put the two colours next to each other on the miniature whilst the paint's still wet and kind of smudge them together. But then with the red, I'm also just going to focus it a bit more on the tops of raised areas. We'll start out with a bit of blending. So I've got some Sanguine Scarlet. We'll take a look for a highlight on here. I'm going to be doing it on an area like this crease that I've got just here. So I'm just going to apply that Sanguine Scarlet into that region very close to where the top highlight's going to be. Then whilst the paint's still wet, just grab the lighter colour, so Demon Red in this case. I'm going to introduce it here and then start pulling it down into the Sanguine Scarlet so the two colours mix. There we go, we get that nice smooth gradient. Now in addition, I'm looking to really reinforce this colour on the very peak of all the top creases where they really stand out. So whilst I did that blending there, I'm just going to now revisit it and just do that colour on its own just on the very top there like that, just for a sharp highlight to finish it off. Then once that's done, it's a matter of going all the way around the outside edge of the cloak as well, almost like an edge highlight, just to get that sharp highlight there on the edge like that. And with that, it's now time to add a fine highlight using an orange. So I've got some orange flare here. And to begin with, I'm just going to introduce a little bit at the very peaks of creases that stand out. So just there, and this one just along here, using this sort of downward swooping motion like this, following the direction of the creases, turning the model as necessary to make sure it's comfortable. And then with that done, it's time for the outer edge once again on parts that really stand out, such as this corner right down here. And with that, the red of the fabric is now completed. And before moving on, I just want to quickly point out that on the loincloth round here, I've just added in a red key line at the bottom of it because I noticed on a picture of the original miniature, that's what Heavy Metal had done and I quite like it. So I've just put that in there with some Demon Red. And so with that done, what we can now do is move on to painting the white details, which I've kept separate from everything else because I want the white to stay nice and crisp and clean. But also some of that white's going to appear on the cloak because remember, this miniature is a conversion based on the Deathwatch Watchmaster. This miniature has all this intricate trim going along the bottom of the cloak. And so we have to do that after doing the wet blending because there'll be no way not to catch it if we try doing it all at the same time. So for this, what I'm going to do is start out with a base coat of an off-white. I've got some Ivory Tusk for this. And then for the shading on the parts that appear on the armour, I'm going to use some Apothecary White. And this will be just for the parts on the armour. You'll see why shortly. But first of all, I'm going to apply the base coat using some Ivory Tusk. And to apply it, I'm going to be sticking to my size 0 brush. And as usual, just a matter of making this paint thin down and ready on the palette and then blocking these features in. Now, what I'm going to be doing is picking out details that on the original model are white. So I'm looking for parts that are going to be loosely in the same area. And that includes things such as on the knees just here. You can see we've got this skull and wreath design. I'm just going to carefully pick out. On the belt, we're going to have things such as the inquisitorial eyes just here. So it's all going to be features like that. Now the tricky one is going to be the trim on the cloak, which you can see running across the bottom of it, and we need to pick all of this out. So this is just a matter of essentially taking your time if you're doing something like this. To use the tip of the brush and just carefully colour them in one at a time, just not rushing it, just being as neat as you can and working your way through. Base coat's now done, so I'm going to move on to putting some Apothecary White on for some shading. Now, I'm not going to do it on this design on here, and that's because it's just too flat, so we don't really need this sort of shading on it, but also it'll be very hard to control it and not get it on the red. Instead, I'm just going to focus on these features that we've got on the armour, such as this one here on the knee, and just going to paint Apothecary White directly over the top to get some shading on these parts. With that, we've now got some shading on those white parts on the armour, but I think on the cloak we just need a little bit more contrast between the white and the red here by just running in some shading into the recessed areas where the two colours meet. So it's different sorts of shading from what we did just previously using that Apothecary White. Instead, this time what I'm going to use is a dark brown. So I've got some cuirass leather here, and what I'm going to do is thin this right down, then run it directly into the corners. So to do this, I'm using my size 00 brush, and this allows us to thin the paint right down to this sort of point, and this way we get a very strong colour and also a very thin one, so ideal for the purpose that we need here, because what I'm going to do is remove excess paint, make sure there's a fine point there, and then start looking at this pattern here and just very carefully just angle the model so I'm comfortable, and then with the tip of the brush I'm just going to run this colour directly into where these two colours meet. So just running all the way around the pattern like this, just to get a bit more distinction between these two areas. And here you can see the difference it makes to do that little bit of fine lining. So with that done, we can now move on to cleaning up the white and then highlighting it. So to do so, what I'm going to first of all do is layer it using Ivory Tusk once more. And then for the highlight, I'm going to use a pure white. So I'm going to use White Star here. But first of all, I'm going to layer with some Ivory Tusk, and really this is just going to be for the armour because it's not necessary on the design on the cloak. So I'm just going to stick to my small brush for it because these parts are all very small, using that size 00 then. And with this, just looking for the flat parts of the white details on the armour, and I'm just going to concentrate on those. So for example, on the skull that we've got just in the middle here, doing things such as the forehead and then around the eyes and picking out the teeth. And finally, it's time to highlight the white details with the pure white. So here I'm using some White Star, and this is going to be mostly like an edge highlight. So for example, around the skull just here, I'm going around the eye sockets there, just picking out the teeth, and then a little line across the top of the head. So it's that sort of thing for those details. Meanwhile, we also have to do the trim. Now this part's going to take a little bit longer, but I'm just going to use the white here just to define the shape of these eyes and the pattern across the top of it by just doing a few lines across it. So on each eye, it's going to be a line on either side. So there, and then just there. And then on the flat of it, I'm going to go down either side of the central column almost. So just there and just there. And with that, all that white detail is now complete. So there's just one more thing that we need to paint on this part of the assembly of our conversion of Coteaz, and that is the glass of his hourglass, just hidden away in there. And here I'm going to go for some dark blue glass. So the first thing to do is to paint it all black. I'm going to use Doom Death Black here, and then I'm going to use a dark blue. Here I'm going for some Abyss Blue. With that done, we can then move on to some Witching Hour Blue, so getting a little bit lighter here, and then I'm going to move on to a bluish grey. Here I'm going for some Gravestone Blue. But first of all, we need to paint it black, so I'm using Doom Death Black, and to apply it, I'm going for my size 0 brush, and this is just going to be a base coat on that glass. So with that paint thinned and ready, it's just a matter of blocking it in. I'm just going to be really careful here because of the proximity to that red cloak just there. It's really going to take my time as I block this in. With that done, I'm now going to move on to some Abyss Blue, and I've thinned this right down because I'm just going to glaze this on quite thinly, and I'm looking to really focus it down in this sort of region here in this part of the glass, and then this sort of region here in the upper part of it. And you can see by thinning it down, that black's showing through really strongly, and it's giving us a subtle, really deep blue to really push the effect further. Next up, I'm going to add some Witching Hour Blue, so a little bit brighter now, and I'm just going to push the colour a little bit more in that same region. Once again, I've thinned the paint down just a little bit, so it's quite runny. I'm just going to just dot it on like this, just to increase the strength of that colour. Next up, it's time to add some Gravestone Blue, and this colour is just going to be focused even more towards this region just here. So on the upper part, that's going to be just in this part, just dotting it in there like that. And on the lower part, it's going to be in this region right here. With this stage reached, I think the glass is looking pretty good, but I think it just needs a little bit more to stand out. So moving on to adding a pure white. I've got some white star here, and with this I'm just going to add a specular highlight. And to do that, all we need is a little dot up there and a little dot just here. And with that, I've now finished painting this part of our conversion of Inquisitor Coteaz, but he does need his faithful companion, that Psyber-Eagle, which I'm going to start painting now. And for this, I'm going to base coat it first of all with a nice medium brown across all the feathers. So here I'm going to use some Ancient Forest. With that done, it's then time to pick out the beaks and the feet with a dark yellow. I'm going to use some dark sun yellow here, and then we can bring it all together with a brown wash. So in this case, I'm going to use some Battlemud Wash. But first of all, I'm going to use some Ancient Forest, and to apply it, I've gone right back to that medium base coat brush I used back in the start. And with this, all I'm going to do is base coat it at this stage. So with that paint thinned and ready, it's just a matter of painting all the feathers and just blocking all of it in. Just being careful of that little gold ring that we've got on its leg just around there. Next, I'm moving on to some dark sun yellow, and with this, it's time to base coat the beaks. So we're looking at just around here, and also the feet as well. And now both those base coats are on there, it's time to apply the wash, and here it's a dark brown wash. I'm using some Battlemud Wash, I'm just going to paint it all the way across the model. Now that the wash is dry, we have a great opportunity to quickly highlight all these brown feathers because they're so textured. It means that dry brushing will be the perfect technique for it. So that's what I'm going to do, starting by returning to some Ancient Forest just to really establish that as a dominant colour. Then we can go lighter with some khaki tones. So I'm going to use some Sandstone here, followed by Temple Stone. But I'm going to start out with Ancient Forest, applied using that small dry brush I used originally on that fur cloak on the main assembly. And with this, just going to get the paint in the brush, work it into the bristles again on some tissue paper until I'm down to about this sort of strength here. And then start dry brushing this onto the feathers. Now something to be wary of here is going to be the fact that it's glued onto this stand here, and I don't want to go too hard so as to break the model off it. So I'm just going to be quite gentle as I do this, just gradually building up that colour as I go. With that done, I'm now going to move on to Sandstone, also dry brushed onto the miniature, and this time it's going to be a lighter, almost flicking motion so that we really bring out the texture of all the feathers. And finally, I'm going to move on to a light khaki colour. In this case, it's going to be Temple Stone, again dry brushed on, but this time really lightly just to pick out the real most defined points of the texture. With that dry brushing done, we've got some nice highlights now on those brown feathers, but we do need to paint in the white ones because we want to go for that eagle colour scheme. And I know the miniature this was based upon wasn't really an eagle, but it's close enough, and I definitely want it to have that right feel for it. So to do this, I'm going to start out with the base coat of some Griffon Claw and then layer it using some Ivory Tusk, and then for a highlight, go for a pure white with some white star. I'm going to start out with a base coat though, and this is going to be some Griffon Claw, and I'm applying it with the size 0 brush. And I'm looking for some specific areas here. The first thing is going to be all the feathers around both heads, and that's going to be these ones just here going up to these quite strong ridges that we've got just in front of the wings. Then also I'm going to be picking out the tail feathers just here, and it's going to be all these longer feathers that we've got down here. Next up, I'm moving on to some Ivory Tusk, and with this, I'm going to be layering it onto the feathers. So on these tail feathers, for example, the plan is to apply it onto the flat areas like this, but just be careful to avoid recesses, just leaving that Griffon Claw showing in those parts. With that, it's time to move on to a highlight with some white star, and I'm going to dry brush this on because once again we're looking at feathers, so there's lots of texture to pick out. It's just a matter of just lightly brushing this across just to pick out all that detail. And with that, all the feathers are now completed, so we can move on to the finishing touches here on the Psyber-Eagle. And the first of these is going to be to clean up the feet and the beaks with that dark sun yellow, so going back to that original colour. And at the same time, we can also pick out the eyes. With that done, we can then highlight the beaks and the feet. And for this, what we're going to use is a pale bone colour. So I'm using Vampire Fang here. Then finally, we can pick out a few features with a pitch black. So I'm going to use some Doom Death Black in this case. But first of all, we're going to return to some darks and yellow, and to apply it, I'm going to go for a really small brush now, so my size 00, because with this there's some layering, but as I mentioned, we can also pick out the eyes. So I'm going to do that first, just making sure that paint's nice and thin down, and we've got that good fine tip on the brush. What I'm going to do is just brace my hands as steady as possible, carefully go in and just apply this into the eyes, so just in there like that. In addition, we're going to be layering on those other features we painted with this colour originally. So we're looking at the beak, just being careful to avoid recessed detail. And also we've got the feet down here as well. Next, it's time to highlight these yellow details, and I'm not concerned about the eyes here, but we're looking at the beak and the feet. So for this, I'm using a pale bone colour, using some Vampire Fang, and it's a matter of highlighting down the centre ridge of the beak there like that, and then a little bit along the side. And on the feet, we're looking for these ridges that stand out. Just want to follow along each one, such as around here and around here, to help these details stand out too. And finally, we just need a pitch black, so I'm going to use some Doom Death Black here. And to begin with, just going to dot it into the eyes for a pupil, so just very carefully applied in there. And then also, I'm going to use it to pick out the claws on the feet. With this done, it's finally time to base the miniature, and in this case I've decided I'm going to go for a grasslands base. And with those bases now fully painted, our version of Inquisitor Coteaz and his Psyber-Eagle are complete and ready to unleash the fury of the Emperor upon the heretic, the demon, and the mutant. So this experience has been loads of fun because it was really enjoyable to make the miniature and even more so to bring it to life. So I hope you've enjoyed the process of seeing how we approach painting a model like this. Now, of course, the miniature we painted was a conversion, and you can do it as well if you want to by following that previous video we did for this showing how to build the miniature. But remember, all the methods and techniques and even the order in which we did things can be applied to the new version of Coteaz, also the old metal version of him as well, and indeed lots of other miniatures with similar colour palettes to this, for example, Adeptus Custodes. So I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something from it, and we'll see you again very soon.